Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 5, Episode 6, presented by Market Dial. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, we've got a very special guest. We are in the shopping mall industry today. We've got Alexandra Lange, whose great book, Meet Me by the Fountain, attracted both our attentions, an inside history of the mall, and it's a fascinating look at shopping malls from someone who isn't a retailer, but rather, how would you describe her? More like she's got an architecture background and sociology. How did you come across the book, and how would you describe Alexandra?
Well, I don't actually remember how I came across the book. Probably like a recommendation on Amazon or something like that. But her primary trade is architecture critic, but she's got a really, as you alluded to, this sociology, anthropology kind of background. And she's not a retailer. I don't know. I found it really fascinating having been in retail a long time, having worked for a couple of mall-based department stores and continuing to consult on occasion to people that have mall-based formats primarily. So, yeah, really, really in-depth, interesting story with a real kind of sociology, anthropological lens on it.
Let's remind everyone that we'll be in Las Vegas for Grocery Shop, and we got an offer code for retailers that want to attend. That's I'll put a link in the show notes. I'll put that offer code into the show notes. So look us up. We're going to be talking grocery and all that great stuff in Las Vegas. Let's talk about the news. Maybe we should have called this the Wobbly Unicorn episode, but we do seem to have some news coming out in a pretty rapid fashion, one after the other, that some of these unicorns, they're struggling, right? These disruptor brands.
Yeah, it was a big week. We talked about Allbirds layoffs last week, and that made me think that their earnings were not going to be so great, and that turned out to be right. We had Warby Parker report, Allbirds report, and the Real. I've picked up on this wobbly unicorn phrasing. Several smart Alecs on social media pointed out to me that Allbirds and the Real are no longer unicorns. So unicorns, by the way, if people aren't familiar with the term, are these, it's a venture capital term about brands that have gotten to $1 billion valuations. And all three brands that reported this week at one point had multi-billion-dollar valuations, but two of the three don't anymore. But anyway, let's just tick them off quickly. So Allbirds, the sustainable shoe company, they had a sales increase of, I think it was about 15%, which is kind of anemic when you think about a brand at their stage of development. But the big news was they managed to lose, I think it was about $29 million, which included also a big inventory write-down. I think about $11 million in inventory they took a write-down on. So that's not so awesome. They're now up to 46 stores, planning to open.
It just opened one in Toronto, actually, this week. They opened up in Yorkdale Shopping Center. Great shopping center. They opened their second. They opened in Vancouver about a month ago, so that makes two.
Yeah, I think they've got about a dozen, maybe international. So more to come there. But you would think with the growth of the brand and all these new retail stores that their sales growth would be a little bit better. But anyway, they're continuing to struggle to be profitable. Their stock is down, 85% or 83% since when they went public. And I went back because I remember talking about Allbirds right after they went public on the podcast and saying that I thought their $4 billion valuation was crazy. So every once in a while, get one of my predictions right. It turns out that
like Forrest Gump, crazy is as crazy does.
Exactly. So they were at $4 billion, and they're now at about $725 million. So that's quite a fall from grace. Warby Parker also recorded about a 14% sales increase and a pretty significant loss. Their loss actually got even bigger than it had been, which is not so great. They also guided that they thought they would only be in the 8 to 10% sales increase range for the year. So that's quite concerning, I would say. They did announce some additional layoffs. They are now at, I think, 170 something stores, so pretty sizable. Just quickly on The RealReal, kind of similar story, actually very, very strong revenue increase, about 47%, I think, was their year-over-year increase. Now, a lot of apparel players, or of course, particularly the higher-end apparel players, are comparing to pretty weak numbers. But same story, very significant operating loss, 34% negative operating margin, again, for a business that's been around for a while. So, yeah, pretty challenging times. Now, I did want to mention quickly, because I sometimes get feedback that I seem to be just really negative on these new DTC brands or digitally native vertical brands or whatever you want to call them. And it's really not that I'm negative. It's just that I think that some of the investment premises that launch these brands and some of the money that has gone into trying to grow them has just been very poorly directed. And there was really a misunderstanding of the underlying economics, which we talked about in an earlier episode with Dan McCarthy. But there are plenty of direct-to-consumer brands that perform quite well, including some that are kind of the same vintage. So Yeti was one of the ones I was taking a look at. Now, Yeti started after Wayfair, but before Warby Parker back in 2006. But they have grown to be a multi-billion-dollar brand with very strong operating performance. Their operating margins are around 11%, I think. Their market cap is greater than the three of these companies combined. So if you look at Yeti, their fundamental strategy was really to start first with wholesale. And even though you don't get the full margin that you get through direct-to-consumer, you don't have to spend nearly the amount of marketing nor have a lot of the overhead support to build the brand. So they built that brand awareness through wholesale partnerships and then started to emphasize e-commerce and have started to open their own stores. They actually don't have that many of their own stores at this point, though the mix is switching pretty aggressively to direct-to-consumer, and they are getting that higher margin now.
They just launched a dedicated Canadian e-commerce site, which is new. They don't have a store here. I think they got 8 or 10 stores in the U.S., but they seem to they put a lot of money into their product, right? They said, let's make a fantastic category creating product and take it to retailers and, be choosy about which retailers we take it to. I think they just pulled out of Lowe's, for example. Like they said, we don't want to be in big box stores. We want to be in specialty or our own or direct so it's very, very strategic to me.
Yeah, they're sort of pulling a Nike. And, so, a lot obviously has changed over the past 10 or 15 years. So it's a little bit hard to completely compare the different strategies as being apples to apples. But I think it is interesting that most of these direct-to-consumer brands that believed they could build brands first, entirely online, but then it was like, well, now we need our own stores, are now actually looking to wholesale as perhaps, I don't know, the salvation, but a way to try to get these brands to be closer to their full potential and improve, somewhat ironically, improve their profitability.
I think it could be a great episode for us, actually. Get Simeon on and talk about, get the three of us chatting. I mean, there is examples, like Nick's, for example, here in Canada. Fantastic Canadian pure play, built a unique product, great team, and they just actually sold to a Swedish company for $320 million. Blue Nile, speaking of pure play startups, Blue Nile got bought by Signet, right? So talk about that. What do you think about maybe that's the case that proves that you can build a pure play to a certain point, but eventually it's got to be something bigger. What do you think of that Blue Nile acquisition?
Well, some people may know Blue Nile is kind of one of the OGs of DTC. They've been around quite a while. I do think at some point they were valued. I didn't go back to look at this, but they were sort of in the Pets.com era, I think, of startups.
They're OG. They're long
and managed to stay around. And I do think they were valued over $1 billion at one point. But they were taken private, I think, by Bain Capital 4 or 5 years ago for $500 and something million. And then they got sold just this past week for $360 million. And they supposedly have about $500 million a year in revenue. So that would be kind of in the vicinity of a Warby Parker. But, that's not a very good multiple. So presumably this is not a business.
Wait a minute.
Yeah. So presumably this is a business that is not making much of any money. But for Signet, who owns several jewelry companies, Zales being probably the most famous one, it's a way to get some I'm sure pretty well developed e-commerce capabilities and a bunch of customers, and give them that famous omni-channel experience. So I think it's interesting. What I think it will be, I believe that we will see more consolidation of some of these brands that have built, sizable business, good brand awareness, but do not have the economics to stand alone as a private equity funded company or go and stay public. As we saw Casper come off the public markets and get acquired as well. So I think we'll see more consolidation.
Now let's talk about Bed Bath and Beyond. So the smart money seems to be going in two different directions. So on the one hand, their stock price went up 40% or some crazy amount like that. But on the other hand, they're putting the fork in some private labels that they just got started with. So what's going on there?
Well, it's kind of Bed Bath and Beyond ridiculous at a certain point, because it's quite a train wreck. So as we talked about several episodes ago, Mark Triton, who came in a few years ago to turn the thing around, got the boot. There's now interim CEO, and they're starting to make some moves to try to salvage the company. They've got actually a pretty weak capital structure. So there's definitely some sense of urgency here to try to right the ship. So Wild Sage, which lots of people were making fun of the name of this private brand on the old interwebs, was one of those private label brands that Triton launched just about a year ago, and that has been shot. So I suspect we will continue to see some pruning of the unproductive merchandise, probably some store closings, some additional cost reductions to try to get this thing in a place where it's not hemorrhaging cash. So it's a pretty sad story. I mean, I think they've gotten kind of like where I feel Toys R Us got to a few years ago, where they got in pretty much an untenable position where it was very difficult for them to raise the capital they needed to make some of the changes. And so it just is kind of could be a death by 1,000 cuts. But this is a pretty big cut, I guess.
Okay, that's a wrap on Hot Takes News. Now, just before we get to our excellent interview with Alexandra Lange from her book, Meet Me by the Fountain, let's hear from our presenting sponsor. MarketDial is an easy-to-use testing platform and emboldens great decisions, leading to reliable, scalable results. With MarketDial, you can be confident in the outcome of your in-store pilot initiatives before rolling them out across your fleet. In a challenging retail climate of supply chain disruption, labor shortages, and dynamic customer behavior, the need for reliable insights has never been greater. Validate your remarkable ideas with MarketDial's in-store testing solution. The proof is in the testing. Learn more at marketdial.com. That's marketdial.com.
Michael and I are excited to welcome Alexandra Lange to the podcast. Alexandra, welcome. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're delighted to have you. I'm super excited to talk to you about your great new book, Meet Me by the Fountain, but we'll get to that in a second. We usually like to just have people start off by telling us a little bit about themselves, a little about their personal and professional journey, if you wouldn't mind, and then we'll dive into the book.
Sure. I'm an architecture and design critic based in Brooklyn. I've written for a whole bunch of publications. I guess my main interest is really in how culture and public space come together. My previous book was called The Design of Childhood, How the Material World Shapes Independent Kids. And I talked a lot in that about schools and playgrounds and how they change children's worlds. So now in the new book, I kind of moved on up to malls.
Natural progression, perhaps. I don't know. But so typically we've done, about 80 episodes or something like that, Michael, I think. And for the most part, everybody we have on is somehow or other a retail person. That is not your background, obviously, which I think is a really interesting lens into the world of retail. So tell us a little bit about your book and how you came to take that on as a topic.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a personal interest. I grew up in Durham, North Carolina, so I spent a lot of time in the mall in the 1980s and early 1990s. For me, it was a really important place when I was growing up, the mall, and I know that that is an experience for a lot of kids who grew up in the 80s and 90s. So I had that in the back of my mind. And then around 2018, I read a news article about Renzo Piano, the Italian architect, designing a place called City Center Bishop Ranch in Northern California. And Piano talked about that as being a piazza and a retail experience. But I was looking at the plans for it and I was like, this is a mall. Why is he designing a mall and why aren't they calling it a mall? So at that point, I kind of dove into research what had been happening in malls over, the past 10 years. And I got really interested in both the original history of malls from the 1950s and in what the mall industry was doing to try to recapture some of the glamour of that early period.
Let's talk about the tradecraft for a while. It's a big project. How did you, the zeitgeist of the malls, how did you get your arms around what you were going to do? And then, for maybe the younger listeners, how they became such an important place in the 80s. I mean, I remember how prominent they were in movies all the way up to that classic movie, The Dawn of the Dead, which was more of a speaking point about culture. But talk a little bit about both the tradecraft and then, again, for folks who may not have grown up in the mall in this generation, talk about their role and your perspective around them.
Well, I am primarily a journalist and critic. And at the time when I started this project, I was the architecture critic for the website Curbed. So in that capacity, I wrote 3 or 4 articles about the mall, kind of picking off little chunks of mall history that I thought were interesting. One was about malls in Manhattan. One was about City Center Bishop Ranch. One was about the rise and fall of the pedestrian mall in cities. And after I'd written all of those pieces and they'd gotten a pretty big response from our audience, I thought, can I put these together into a book? What would a book about the mall really look like? And the pieces that I wrote kind of covered the present day and a little bit back to the 1970s. But I was already aware of the story of Victor Gruen, really the inventor of the indoor shopping mall in the 1950s. So I just felt like a chronological structure kind of from dawn to possible dusk of the mall made the most sense. But I knew I was going to have to do a hell of a lot of historical research in order to make that happen. Like I had really just carved up the easiest, most recent part of the history.
It's a deep, rich history. And Steve and I were talking off mic that, we both work for mall-based retailers. So we've spent a fair bit of time thinking about malls, both personally and professionally. And we learned a lot just from the book. So is that where you started that history? Now, you mentioned Victor Gruen. Who was he and what is the Gruen transfer all about?
Well, that's great to hear, just first of all, from the perspective of people in retailing that you didn't know this history. I mean, I'm always trying to kind of reveal to people that these things, these places that they visit every day actually have this deep, rich history, and there are lots of fascinating figures, and we just kind of go about our business unawares a lot of the time. And Victor Gruen is definitely kind of the star of this show, I think. He was an incredibly good salesman on top of everything else. But he was a Viennese emigre architect. He was Jewish and he fled the Nazis and came to New York in 1938. And he was the one who really had the realization that the suburbs needed a place where people could come together. They needed a community space. And he realized that if you organized all of the disparate shops that were kind of strung out along the new highways that were being built into a more beautiful, more connected place, you could recapture some of the urban life that he remembered from growing up in Vienna. So that was his idea about the mall.
Was he trying to recapture, marketplaces aren't new. They go back many, many centuries or thousands of years, right? A gathering of merchants together that forms around it and the community comes together. Farmers markets today. Was that informing his vision? And I guess, how did we get away from that? How did we get into, was it infrastructure and highways that kind of started to spread out and kind of decouple retail from the people and the communities they were in?
He was absolutely thinking about marketplaces and more ancient forms. A lot of the mall histories that I read to inform my history referenced the ancient Greek agora, I actually chose not to do that because I thought, why do we always have to reference the Greeks? But
Greeks get enough time.
Right. Maybe it was necessary. So yes, there's definitely a long human history of gathering together in a central square in cities that has civic infrastructure and market infrastructure, often with food and other things like that. And the mall is definitely is born out of that pattern, and I think born out of that human need for coming together. In terms of the sprawl of post-war development, that was kind of an unintended consequence. In the post-war era, the government heavily subsidized the building of the new interstate system, and they also heavily subsidized mortgages for returning servicemen to buy single-family homes. But those subsidies encouraged sprawl and did not include monies for central gathering spaces. It was kind of like they expected people to be in their cars, or they expected them to be in their houses. And I think it's part of Gruen's genius to realize that really wouldn't do. Like, people would be incredibly unhappy if that was the only structure of their lives. And so the mall becomes this bridge structure between the roads and the homes, and honestly gave the women and children that tended to be living in those suburban homes a place to go during the day and meet their friends.
Yeah, it's really, I want to talk a little bit maybe about kind of the different phases of how malls have evolved over the past 50 or 60 years. But one of the things that we've touched on a few times on the podcast, which I often find when I talk to younger people, they have a hard time getting their heads around, is this idea that going to a mall could actually be convenient. That because, in this era of being able to shop online and having access to all sorts of different shopping alternatives in your neighborhood, this idea that a mall could be convenient. But I think it gets back to what Gruen was trying to create, this place of vast choice, community center, and even, the Gruen transfer ideas. I understand part of that is about getting lost in the space, right? You come there for one thing and you end up staying for a whole bunch of other things. Do I have that basically right?
Yeah, you do have that right. And I would say the 21st century online version of the Gruen transfer is probably the endless scroll. Like, you go online to look one thing up, and suddenly 45 minutes later, you've looked up 25 things. Yeah, the Gruen transfer, Gruen's idea was partially about making errands more convenient. Here in one place, you can pick up your dry cleaning, buy new shoes for your kid, have lunch with your friend, et cetera, all these things in one place. But he also realized if you made that place interesting and fun, people would want to stay longer. And then they would probably go into extra stores, and then they would spend their money. So there's definitely a capitalist underpinning to the whole thing, but it also makes your errands a much more pleasant experience.
So how would you say, as Michael and I mentioned, or Michael mentioned about both of us having this history working for mall-based department stores way back when, one of the things that I started to see, I guess, probably the late 90s, there was such a growth in these category killers and discount mass merchants like Walmart and Target that started to pull traffic away from the mall. Did you see much in your research? Did you see much of a change or a pivot to how the traditional regional malls started to change then, or how would you kind of think about the different phases over the years?
There's definitely a downturn in malls when the big box retailers start up. And it's really part of a longer downward trend in the department store industry in general. If you look at a lot of the really successful malls today, they're the ones with the higher end department stores, like Neiman Marcus and Nordstrom, because the middle and lower end department stores are doing much worse, and that whole part of the industry has really been hollowed out. And when I talked to some people that had been in department stores for a long time, they said that really there was this kind of bifurcated system now, where the people that used to shop at, middle range department stores like Macy's or Dillard's or Belk's, if you're in the South, were now shopping at Target and Walmart, whereas the high end was continuing to shop at Neiman Marcus and Nordstrom. This whole section of the industry, these middle class anchor department stores that served many malls, were just gone or not doing well. And that was really damaging to the whole industry.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like those people read my book, because that's what I say in my book.
Well, that's good because, as you know, business is not my background. So I spent a lot of time trying to get up to speed on consolidation in the department store industry, consolidation in the mall industry, and things like that underlies some of the cultural patterns. Or, as a shopper, you see something happening, but you don't know what the reason is.
Sure. Well, what I think is so interesting about the book, I mean, I do think that, first of all, you wouldn't necessarily know unless you stated it that you didn't come from outside of retail, because there's such a rich series of stories and takes. I think that's super, super interesting. But I wonder, before, just I have a couple other questions, but I'm curious, just, so much of what you write about in the book deals with, though you have a chapter at the end that kind of gets into this, deals with American malls, sort of the American dream, both as a bigger concept as well as literally a new mall. Any commentary about how malls play a different role, if they do, in the rest of the world?
Yeah, my conclusion really talks about malls in Asia and South America, and a little bit of an older history of malls in parts of Europe, particularly the United Kingdom. And yeah, I think my main takeaway for malls in other countries is that they tend to be much more urban, they tend to be much more connected to public transportation, and they tend to include a lot more public services. So they're really fulfilling that community function that Gruen talked about at the beginning, but they're much less sprawl dependent.
Well, speaking of sprawl, one of the things I wanted to get your take on, you sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but one of the things that I found, particularly the last few years, as I go to visit certain malls, whether we're talking about Tyson's Corner, where I was not too long ago, I guess any of the sort of mega regional malls, is my response to them today is I almost find them just comically large, like so ridiculously huge, difficult to navigate, and very kind of antiseptic and soulless. And I'm wondering, particularly as an architecture critic, but as well as the way you've studied the evolution of malls, do you agree that they're sort of built for an era that no longer exists? Is there some hope in your mind for some of these malls to actually be relevant in the future without dramatic change?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because one of the interesting things about malls for an architecture critic is that they have been so constantly upgraded and constantly added onto that it's hard to find a historic mall. And that's one of the reasons why I spend a lot of time in my second chapter on North Park in Dallas, because there you can actually see part of the mall that was built in 1965. And that is super rare in this day and age. And one of the things I like about North Park, and this is a commentary on a lot of the new malls, is the materials that it's built with. It has polished concrete floors and very particular white brick and fountains. And a lot of more recent malls all look alike, and they all have this super slick marble floors. They're very white, very bright, cold lighting. And I think that's what a lot of mall owners have done to refresh the look of their malls. We don't want it to look like the 90s anymore. No more, tan tile, no more turquoise accents. But the result is that, to me, everything looks a little bit like an airport hotel, and there's really very little sense of place or difference in them. And I've seen pictures of the Mall of America recently, and they've done that also to the Mall of America. And when the Mall of America opened in the early 90s, there was one whole wing that was supposed to look like a theme park version of New Orleans. And that, to me, is so much more intriguing than just another light, bright marble space. So I think in trying to make themselves look new and upscale, they have kind of given away a lot of the character and charm that made them memorable. And I also think there sort of is a square footage, and I'm not sure I could put a number on this, at which a mall just becomes unmanageable. And at the beginning of the book, I talk about my visit to American Dream in northern New Jersey, which is this 3 million square foot mall that took 17 years to build. And it just opened and it already feels unmanageable. Like it doesn't have any sort of structure. And the earlier malls that I talk about from the 60s and 70s had these very clear plans that I describe as looking at like letters, an L-shaped plan or a V-shaped plan or an E-shaped plan. So you sort of knew where you were inside the mall. But these new ones are just these blobs that seem to go on forever. And if all the flooring looks the same, you don't know when you've gotten from sector A to sector C.
So you mentioned American Dream. I'm just curious maybe for a quick commentary, because I think, one of the other big high profile malls that opened in the last 2 years and I think landed with a big thud was Hudson Yards. Do you have any commentary on that? Because I think a lot of people, even though obviously many people that listen to this haven't necessarily been there, but that was such a high profile project that got so much publicity. Any commentary on what went right, what went wrong in that particular development?
Yeah, that Hudson Yards is actually one of the malls that I wrote about before I even started writing my book, because I live in Brooklyn and it was kind of the biggest architecture story in New York at that time. I feel like when I describe, many of the good things about Asian malls to people, that they're more vertical, that they're located over public transportation, that they have, a wide variety of shops and are an oasis in the city. That sounds like what Hudson Yards was supposed to be, but I just think from a design point of view, it really failed. I would say primarily because it doesn't really have a central space and it doesn't have a food court adjacent to a central space that kind of gives it life. So every time I've gone there, I've felt kind of lost, and I feel like there's nowhere to meet. It has those super slick materials, marble, glass railings, stainless steel. And it doesn't feel like something that is unique to New York or even kind of unique within the world of malls. And I feel like if you're going to build a vertical mall in New York, it really has to have some flair and flavor.
So interesting. I mean, and there's so much to talk about in terms of the future as well. Let's talk about the future. I mean, let's talk about the post-COVID world. There's less people working in offices, and a lot of these malls are based on commuters. I'm thinking of one close to you, the Westfield World Trade Center. The one that's at the Oculus. Pretty cool looking mall. Not too far from Hudson Yards. We were talking off mic about the Eaton Center in Toronto here, which relies really heavily on commuters. And what do you see next for malls? I mean, we hear often the live, work, play, shop. I mean, I guess that was the broader vision behind Hudson Yards. But what are you thinking of, and what are your, what's next for malls in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real difference between urban malls and suburban malls and their trajectory. The Oculus at the World Trade Center has never really done well, and I think it suffers from some of the same spatial issues as Hudson Yards. But on the other hand, the Winter Garden at Brookfield Place, which is basically just across the West Side Highway, which has this huge food court as well as a bunch of high-end shops, is still really highly trafficked. I went there for lunch a few weeks ago because people are back in the office buildings around it, as well as it being connected to Battery Park City, which is a huge residential area, and that's doing just fine. So I think that is a better designed space to start with, and then it repositioned itself with the food court very well for, what I think is going to be a major driver for malls of the future, which is just more food, more different kinds of food, more interesting food options. Like the food court is going to go from being, like 1/4 of the space around the atrium to going all the way around the atrium.
I see lots of landlords calling them districts, right? Even in the one you're referring to, Brookfield Place, I think they call it Le District. And here we have, these more bespoke, not even calling them a food court is a bit misleading, right?
What I found was that mall people, people in the business are always trying to rebrand everything, right? So they don't want to call it a food court because food court makes people think of Orange Julius and teenagers and, kind of slight grimy orange tables or whatever. But I mean, it is a food court. You can call it something different, but it's better because honestly, I think people in general expect better food nowadays. I know of mall redevelopment projects where in the old department store space, they're doing one of these districts or food halls where it's a combination of, kiosks, eat-in restaurants, and then places where you can get kind of gourmet groceries to take home, like a mini Whole Foods.
Sure, like a good fishmonger or a good butcher kind of thing. A mix of both, right? So a place to go, not just to for folks in the neighborhood to go and stop in on the way home, right? You see that happening more often?
Definitely. And I think that's also a good example of a business that would serve both commuters and people who are maybe working from home and, need to meet someone for lunch or need a reason to go out during the day because they don't want to be stuck in their house 24/7. Right. So it's pretty flexible in terms of who's going to use it and what hours they're going to use it.
Right on. Well, our guest is Alexandra Lange. The book is Meet Me by the Fountain, an inside history of the mall. Highly recommend. Available now at your favorite bookstores. Alexandra, thanks so much for joining us on Remarkable Retail. It was a great discussion and great book, and congratulations. As Steve said, it took me a little bit by surprise. Your insights are so rich and deep in and around retail, but you don't come from a retail background, so it's really interesting how different disciplines can inform retail. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me and all the great questions.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast platform, so you can catch up with all our great interviews, like our discussion with Seth Godin on what retailers can actually do to fight climate change. New episodes of Season 5, presented by Marketal, will show up each and every week. And be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker, and producer and host of a series of retail trade podcasts, including this one, plus the host of the popular YouTube cooking show Last Request Barbecue. You can learn even more about me on LinkedIn or meleblanc.co. Safe travels, everyone.